So we're continuing on with chapter 22, and we're now going to move to the lower respiratory system. And the lower respiratory system consists of the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. And it's broken into two zones, the respiratory zone and the conducting zone. The respiratory zone is going to be the site of gas exchange, and it's going to consist of microscopic structures such as respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveoli. And then we have the conducting zone, and these are conduits that just transport gas to and from gas exchange sites. And this is going to include all of the respiratory structures, and it's also going to play a role in cleansing, warming, and humidifying air. Then we have the larynx. And the larynx is also known as the voice box. It has three functions. Excuse me. One is to provide a patent airway, which means open airway. Another one is to route air and food into proper channels. And then it also plays a role in voice production, which is what's called the voice box. It houses the vocal cords. The epiglottis is going to cover the laryngeal inlet during swallowing. So we can see this is the hyoid bone here. So this is a thyroid cartilage. Above this is the hyoid bone. And then above this we see the epiglottis. All right, vocal folds. So the vocal ligaments form the core of the vocal folds, and these are called the true vocal cords. The opening between the vocal folds is called the glottis, and the folds will actually vibrate, and that's how they produce sound, like as the air rushes up from the lungs. The vestibular folds are also known as the false vocal cords. They're superior to the vocal folds. They don't play any part in sound production, but they do help to close the glottis during swallowing. So again, we have the epiglottis is up here. Epi means above, and down here is the glottis, the opening. Let's see, we have the vocal fold here, the true vocal cord, and then above that we have the vestibular fold. Again, the epiglottis is up here, and it's going to close off. And the glottis is the opening. And then this would also be the glottis. And then this is the epiglottis up here. Epiglottis up here. There are not going to be any questions about labeling stuff on the exam for lecture. So you don't have to worry about where those items are. You just need to know if it helps you to see a picture and to understand the meaning of it and what it does, then look at the picture. Otherwise, you can just focus on the actual definition. All right, voice production. So speech. Intermittent release of expired air during opening and closing of glottis. That's how speech is produced. So that's it. Pitch is determined by the length and tension of the vocal cords, and loudness depends upon the force of air. So the more air, the louder it's going to be. The qualities of the pharynx and oral, nasal, and sinus cavities amplify and enhance the sound quality. And then sound itself is shaped into language by the muscles of the pharynx, the tongue, the soft palate, and the lips. The trachea extends from the larynx into the mediastinum, where it divides into two main bronchi. It's about 4 inches long, about 3/4 of an inch diameter, real flexible. I took out a lot of the stuff as far as the anatomy of the trachea, but I do want you to know that it does consist of that hyaline cartilage that helps keep it open, and then the rest of this you don't have to worry about. So air passages undergo 23 orders of branching, and the branching is referred to as the bronchial tree. So from the tips of the bronchial tree, the conducting zone structures give rise to the respiratory zone structures, which makes sense because we're going from the structures that are actually kind of playing a role in transporting air to where the actual gas exchange is occurring. Conducting zone structures. So trachea divides, forms right and left main bronchi. The fact that the right main bronchus is wider and shorter and more vertical than the left is not something you need to know. Each excuse me, each main bronchus enters the hilum of one lung, and then it branches, and then each main bronchus branches into lobar or secondary bronchi. 3 on the right, 2 on the left. Each lobar bronchus supplies one lobe. Then each lobar bronchus branches into segmental or tertiary bronchi. And then segmental bronchi divide repeatedly. The branches are going to become smaller and smaller, and we get all the way down to a diameter of less than 1 millimeter, and those are bronchioles. And then the smallest of all the branches are the terminal bronchioles, and they have a diameter less than 0.5 millimeters. So we have the trachea, and then the bronchi, and then this is showing going into the lobar or secondary bronchus here, and then segmental would be down in here. So as you move from the bronchi to the bronchioles, a number of changes occur. One is the support structures change. The cartilage rings become irregular plates, can't speak. In bronchioles, elastic fibers replace cartilage altogether. The epithelium type changes from pseudostratified columnar to cuboidal, and then cilia and goblet cells become more sparse. And then the amount of smooth muscle increases, which is going to allow the bronchioles to provide substantial air resistance or resistance to air passage. The respiratory zone begins where terminal bronchioles feed into respiratory bronchioles, which lead into alveolar ducts, and then finally alveolar sacs. The sacs can contain, the sacs do contain clusters of alveoli. About 300 million alveoli make up most of the volume of the lung, and they are the sites of actual gas exchange. So you can see we have a respiratory bronchiole and then this like cluster of alveoli. Same thing here, respiratory bronchiole, cluster of alveoli. This is again showing a respiratory bronchiole, and then all throughout here are the alveoli. This is simple squamous epithelial tissue, and those are alveoli. The blood-air barrier, so the respiratory membrane is a blood-air barrier that consists of alveolar and capillary walls along with their fused basement membranes. So it's that whole segment that's kind of up next to each other. So the alveoli and the capillary walls are like right there next to each other. And this is going to be a really, really thin membrane, less than 0.5 micrometers. And this is going to allow gas exchange across the membrane by simple diffusion. So oxygen and CO2 are literally just moving by simple diffusion. The alveolar wall consists of a single layer of simple squamous epithelium, which are going to be your type 1 alveolar cells, and then scattered cuboidal type 2 alveolar cells that are going to secrete surfactant and antimicrobial proteins. Now, surfactant, we're going to talk about later. But just so you know, surfactant is something that's going to help keep the alveoli from collapsing, and they are somewhat prone to collapsing because they're covered in the surface of water, and water has a tendency to want to collapse, like bind to itself, and so that's going to cause the alveoli to collapse. There's some other significant features of the alveoli. They're surrounded by fine elastic fibers and pulmonary capillaries. And then we have these things called alveolar pores, and they have a number of functions. They connect adjacent alveoli, they equalize pressure throughout the lung, and they provide alternative routes in case of blockages. And then alveolar macrophages do probably what you would imagine. They keep the alveolar surfaces sterile. And then this is a really disgusting statistic. 2 million dead macrophages per hour are carried by the cilia to the throat and swallowed. And that is something that I definitely could have gone my whole entire life without knowing. I don't know, maybe I'm alone in that. All right, so we have no cursor. We have our alveoli, and then this would be our capillary bed. This is showing the respiratory membrane. So the respiratory membrane would be the membrane, they don't really blow it up and show it, but it would be the membrane between the capillary and the alveoli. This is showing pulmonary capillary cast. So the alveoli would have been inside here, where you see kind of the little holes, not like holes, but openings, kind of round openings. That would be where the alveoli would have been. This is showing a number of things. This is showing alveolar pores. This is showing the macrophages, which are going to keep the alveoli sterile. This is showing a type 2 alveolar cell, which is going to secrete surfactant. And then we also have the type 1 alveolar cell, which is just making up the alveoli, or the alveolus. And then here are your questions. All right, you guys have a good day.